Chapter 15, Aftermath and Impact. By the time the courtroom lights dimmed and the last appeals were filed, the story of Tony Carruthers had been etched into Memphis lore. But the case wasn't just another entry in a law book. It left deep scars on the families of Marcello's, Cello Anderson, his mother Deloise, and Frederick Tucker, and it reshaped legal doctrine in Tennessee. This chapter reflects on what happened to those left behind, why lawyers still cite the case in law school, and the uncomfortable themes of greed, betrayal, and punishment that run through the story. Families and the community in mourning. For the Anderson and Tucker families, the events of February 1994 were nothing short of catastrophic. A beloved son, a devoted mother, and a teenage friend vanished from their ordinary routines, only to be discovered a week later beneath a stranger's coffin at Rose Hill Cemetery. The funeral home had lowered a casket onto the pit, unaware that 3 people were buried underneath. 367248374093168L0L0. Such macabre details, bodies hidden under plywood and a pressed-wood vault, shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. News anchors described the murders as one of the most shocking crimes in Memphis history, and neighborhood parents warned their children about the dangers of trusting the wrong people. The pain did not stop with the arrests. When co-defendant James Montgomery quietly pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and walked free with time served in 2015, the victims' families were blindsided. A researcher noted that the families were not notified of his release, and this oversight became a major news story. Prosecutors said it was the Department of Corrections' job to send notifications, and prison officials argued that families had to sign up for alerts. To relatives who had spent more than 20 years believing both men would die in prison, the bureaucratic explanation rang hollow. They spoke to reporters about feeling betrayed by the system, first by Carruthers, who had been a family friend, and later by officials who failed to tell them when his accomplice walked free. Beyond the immediate families, the wider community felt the impact. The case dominated talk radio and barbershop conversations. Civic leaders worried that Memphis's reputation would suffer from yet another high-profile crime. Church pastors preached about the corrosive influence of the drug trade and urged young people to stay away from the streets. Even long after the trial, people still remembered the phrase, "buried alive," repeated in news stories and appeals. In 2019, defense lawyers noted that the "buried alive" narrative resonated powerfully with the public, even though later experts questioned whether all 3 victims were still breathing when dirt covered them. The horror of that phrase stuck in Memphis's collective memory and kept the case alive in local lore. A legal landmark. Carruthers' case gained notoriety not only for its cruelty but also for its unusual procedural twists. After running off 6 court-appointed attorneys with threats and insults, Carruthers was forced to represent himself at his capital trial. His behavior, angry outbursts, refusal to cooperate, and threats against lawyers, tested the limits of the Sixth Amendment. The Tennessee Supreme Court's 2000 decision in State v. Carruthers held that an indigent defendant may implicitly waive or even forfeit the right to counsel by using that right to manipulate or disrupt the court. The court explained that if a defendant persists in inappropriate behavior despite warnings about losing counsel, a trial judge may require him to proceed without representation. This concept of forfeiture went beyond simply waiving counsel; it punished misconduct that obstructed justice. Law students now study this case alongside classics like Faretta v. California to understand how far self-representation can go. Subsequent cases have cited Carruthers when determining whether defendants can be forced to proceed pro se. The Tennessee capital case bench book notes that the right to counsel cannot be used as a license to manipulate or delay trial proceedings. Only the most egregious misbehavior justifies forfeiture. Judges must hold evidentiary hearings and give defendants chances to reform before pulling the plug on their attorneys. In short, the case stands as a warning to defendants who think firing lawyer after lawyer will stall a trial. Such tactics can backfire. It also serves as a cautionary tale for courts, reminding them to balance a defendant's rights with the need for orderly proceedings. The case has another distinction. If the execution moves forward, Tony Carruthers could become the first person in nearly a century to be put to death after being forced to represent himself. This fact underscores just how unusual his situation is. While self-representation happens in criminal courts, capital defendants almost always have lawyers at trial and on appeal. Carruthers' insistence on representing himself, in spite of mental illness and repeated warnings, created a rare scenario that legal scholars continue to debate. Themes of greed and betrayal. At its core, the crime was rooted in greed. Marcellus Anderson was known to wear expensive jewelry, carry large sums of cash and stash money in his mother's attic. He trusted Tony Carruthers as a friend, believing they were partners in the neighborhood hustle. Carruthers and the Montgomery brothers saw an opportunity: rob Anderson for his drugs and cash, then eliminate the witnesses. They even believed that by burying the bodies under a funeral casket, police would have no case without corpses. This cold-hearted calculus, killing a friend for a quick score, shows how the drug trade warps relationships and values. As one prosecutor observed, the murder of Deloise Anderson sent a chilling message to others in the drug scene: if you cross us, we won't hesitate to kill your mother. Betrayal permeates the story. Anderson thought he was meeting friends when he got into the Jeep on February 24, but those friends kidnapped him. Alfredo Shaw, an informant with a checkered history, later admitted he lied about Carruthers' confession yet helped prosecutors gain indictments. Even the legal system has its betrayals. The victims' families felt betrayed when they weren't told Montgomery would be released. At every level, trust was broken for personal gain. The dangers of drug trade violence. This case is a stark reminder of how the drug trade breeds violence. In early 1990s Memphis, crack cocaine and heroin were rampant. Young men like Anderson and Carruthers saw the drug trade as a way out of poverty. They bought flashy clothes and cars, but the money came at a price. Arguments over territory or money often ended in bloodshed. The idea of burying victims alive, or at least portraying them as such, shows the lengths to which criminals went to send messages and enforce fear. The crime also highlights how drug violence spills into families. Deloise Anderson wasn't involved in the drug trade, yet she was murdered because of her son's lifestyle. Frederick Tucker, just 17, was caught in the crossfire. Their deaths illustrate that the consequences of drug trafficking radiate far beyond those who choose to participate. The complexities of capital punishment. As Carruthers' execution date approaches, the case forces Tennesseans to confront the moral and practical complexities of the death penalty. On one hand, the heinous nature of the crime and the suffering of the victims make many people, especially the victims' families, feel that death is the only appropriate punishment. They have waited decades for closure and see the execution as justice finally served. On the other hand, Carruthers' mental health issues raise questions about executing someone whose brain damage and psychosis may impair his understanding of the punishment. Moreover, his forced self-representation and the possibility of being the first person executed under such circumstances make some observers uneasy. Legal experts note that the "buried alive" narrative, used by prosecutors to justify the death penalty, might have been exaggerated. Later medical experts testified that there was no evidence all three victims were alive at burial. If true, this undercuts one of the aggravating factors that persuaded the jury. Yet the phrase remains in court opinions and news stories, shaping public perception. This tension, between the emotive power of a story and the factual record, illustrates how capital cases can hinge on narratives rather than solely on evidence. Finally, the case underscores how long capital litigation lasts. The murders occurred in 1994, nearly 3 decades later, appeals continue, mental health evaluations are still being conducted, and families are still waiting. In a system where death sentences can take decades to carry out, victims' relatives may relive their trauma repeatedly. Critics of the death penalty argue that such delays render it ineffective, while supporters counter that the process must be thorough to avoid executing the innocent. Chapter 16, Epilogue, Lessons and Legacy. After more than 3 decades, the saga of Tony Vaughn Carruthers still hangs in the air like the mist that settles over Rose Hill Cemetery on a cold morning. What began as a brutal crime in 1994 has evolved into a marathon of appeals, petitions, mental health evaluations and legal debates that continues into 2026. This epilogue reflects on why the case has lingered in the courts, what it teaches us about justice and mercy, and how the image of a quiet graveyard continues to haunt Memphis. A case that will not die. The legal odyssey of Tony Carruthers is extraordinary for its length and complexity. In 1996, a jury convicted Carruthers and James Montgomery of murdering Marcellos Anderson, Deloise Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. Shortly thereafter, the Tennessee Supreme Court affirmed Carruthers' convictions but granted Montgomery a new trial. Carruthers then embarked on a relentless campaign of appeals and petitions, arguing ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, Brady violations, and later mental incompetence. Tennessee courts rejected his claims, noting that he had forfeited his right to counsel by threatening and abusing his attorneys. He petitioned for DNA testing of evidence. The courts found the results minimally helpful. He turned to federal court. The Sixth Circuit concluded that the state court's rulings were not contrary to Supreme Court precedent. Despite these denials, the case refuses to close. In September 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court again denied Carruthers' request for commutation and set his execution date for May 21, 2026, directing the warden of Riverbend Maximum Security Institution to carry out the sentence. However, the court also ordered a competency hearing and required Carruthers to file his petition alleging incompetence in February 2026. As of January 2026, news reports still list his execution on the calendar but note that he has appealed multiple times and that the outcome is uncertain. In other words, 30 years after the crime, the courts and the public continue to ask, will this sentence ever be carried out? Human stories behind the law. It is easy to get lost in the legal jargon, implicit waiver, forfeiture of counsel, AEDPA deference, but at its core this case is about people. Marcellos Cello Anderson was a young man who loved expensive jewelry and the fast life. He may have been involved in drugs, but he was also a son and brother. Deloise Anderson was a devoted mother who worked hard to support her family. Frederick Tucker was just 17, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their lives ended in terror beneath a casket. For their families, the decades of appeals have been a second ordeal. They have sat through hearing after hearing, reliving the details of the murders while lawyers argued over procedural rules. When James Montgomery was quietly released in 2015, the families were not notified. They felt betrayed by a system that not only failed to prevent the murders but also neglected to tell them when one of the killers walked free. As the prospect of Carruthers' execution looms, they remain torn between the desire for closure and the exhaustion of endless litigation. On the other side is Tony Carruthers himself. Mental health experts have described him as deeply ill. Dr. Pamela Aubel concluded that his mental illness distorted his appreciation of reality and predicted brain damage. Dr. Sean Agarkar found that his delusional thinking and organic brain impairment left him unable to understand legal proceedings or assist in his own defense. Other experts discovered significant damage in major portions of his brain. Carruthers remains on death row, vacillating between rage and paranoia, convinced that he was framed. Whether he truly understands why he is scheduled to die is a question the upcoming competency hearing will attempt to answer. These human stories remind us that legal proceedings are not just abstract exercises. They involve mothers who bury children, fathers who never see justice, defendants who descend into mental illness, and lawyers who struggle to balance ethics and advocacy. The case asks whether it is possible to deliver justice when so much time has passed and so much damage has been done. Lessons learned. One of the enduring lessons of this case is how a defendant's own behavior can shape his fate. Carruthers' threats and manipulations led the trial judge to remove his attorneys and compel him to proceed pro se. The Tennessee Supreme Court used his case to establish that defendants can implicitly waive or forfeit their right to counsel through egregious misconduct. That precedent now guides trial courts across the state and serves as a warning to other defendants: use your right to counsel as a sword, and you might lose it. It also illustrates the tension between protecting constitutional rights and preserving the orderly administration of justice. Another lesson involves the power of narrative. Prosecutors repeatedly told the jury and appellate courts that the victims were buried alive, emphasizing the horror to justify the death penalty. This phrase entered public consciousness and still appears in news stories about the case. Yet later expert testimony suggested that two of the victims were likely dead or unconscious when buried. The persistence of the "buried alive" narrative shows how emotive imagery can shape public perception and legal outcomes, even when the facts are disputed. It underscores the importance of scrutinizing prosecutorial rhetoric and ensuring that sentencing decisions rest on solid evidence. Finally, the case reveals the complexities of capital punishment. Supporters argue that the heinousness of the crime warrants death. Opponents point to Carruthers' mental illness and the extraordinary length of the proceedings. As one commentator observed, if executed he would be the first person in nearly a century put to death after being forced to represent himself. This raises profound moral questions. Is it just to execute a man whose own behavior sabotaged his defense? Does mental illness diminish culpability? Do decades of delays erode the retributive purpose of the death penalty? The case does not provide easy answers, but it forces us to confront these questions head-on. Returning to Rose Hill. As we close this series, it is worth returning to where it all began. Rose Hill Cemetery sits quietly in South Memphis, its rows of headstones casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. To a passerby, it looks like any other burial ground. Yet beneath one grave lies a story that continues to reverberate through courtrooms and communities. In March 1994, detectives lifted a casket and found 3 bodies hidden under plywood and dirt. That image, bodies stacked in a shallow pit intended for someone else's coffin, captures the brutality of the crime and the disregard for human life. The cemetery also symbolizes the case's long shadow. For the victims' families, every appeal hearing drags them back to that grave. For the Memphis community, Rose Hill is a reminder of a time when violence invaded sacred space. For lawyers and judges, the site marks the origin of a legal precedent that still shapes trials today. And for Tony Carruthers, the grave is both the centerpiece of the state's case against him and the locus of his insistence that he was framed. As the May 2026 execution date approaches, one thing is certain: the long shadow cast by Rose Hill Cemetery will not vanish quickly. Whether Carruthers is executed, deemed incompetent, or spared through clemency, the lessons and legacy of this case will endure. It reminds us that justice is messy, that human stories lie beneath legal arguments, and that the places where we bury our dead can still speak volumes about who we are and what we value. Chapter 17, Execution Date and Competency Petition, 2025-26. Nearly 3 decades after the murders, the Tennessee Supreme Court set Tony Carruthers' execution date. Chapter 17 covers the court's order and the legal maneuvering around competency to be executed. Setting the date. On September 30, 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court granted the state's motion to set an execution date. It denied Carruthers' request for commutation and scheduled his execution for May 21, 2026. The court found no legal reason to stop the sentence. This is remarkable, because few capital cases drag on this long. Carruthers' legal maneuvers delayed the inevitable, but the court signaled it was time to bring the case to a close. Competency petition timeline. Recognizing the ongoing mental health debate, the court ordered Carruthers to file any petition alleging incompetence between February 11 and 13, 2026. This tight window ensures a competency determination occurs close to the execution date. If the trial court finds him incompetent, his execution will be delayed until he is restored. If he is found competent, the execution will proceed on May 21. Context and media coverage. Local media reported that Carruthers would be one of 4 Tennessee death row prisoners scheduled for execution in 2026. The others are Anthony Hines, August 13, Krista Pike, September 30, and Gary Wayne Sutton, December 3. The schedule comes after controversial lethal injections in 2025. That led to a pause and a review of protocols. Some Groups continue to challenge the drugs used, arguing they cause excessive pain. If executed, Carruthers would be the first person in Tennessee executed after representing himself at trial, a grim milestone. Waiting for the final ruling. As the date approaches, the legal teams prepare. Tony's attorneys gather mental health records to support his incompetency claim. The state prepares to argue he understands the punishment. Families of the victims wait once more. There is a sense that after decades of delays, the case may finally reach its conclusion. Whether you support the death penalty or oppose it, Chapter 17 captures the final act in a tragedy that has spanned generations. Chapter 18, Co-Defendant Developments and Community Reaction. The story doesn't end with Tony. Chapter 18 looks at what happened to his co-defendants and how the community reacted to developments over the years. James Montgomery's quiet release. In December 2015, James Montgomery quietly walked out of prison. He had pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder and received credit for time served. There was no parole or probation. He was simply free. The release happened without much public attention. Until a WREG investigative report revealed it. When families of the victims heard the news, they were outraged. They had assumed both killers would die in prison. The Department of Corrections responded that it only notifies victims who register with its system. One letter was sent on October 13, 2015 about Montgomery's pending release. Because he was released with no supervision, the state couldn't say where he was living. The lack of transparency led to calls for reform. Lack of notification and reforms. Families argued it was unacceptable to require victims to sign up to get notifications. In response to the public outcry, Tennessee began revising its notification system. The new policy automatically alerts victims and their families when offenders are set to be released or moved. The Rosehill case and James's release became a catalyst for these changes. Carruthers's phone call from death row. After learning about James's release, Tony Carruthers phoned WREG from death row. He complained that the courts were delaying his case and said he wanted to reopen his post-conviction claims. Carruthers's call showed he was still fighting, still defiant. Jonathan Montgomery. Little is known about Jonathan Montgomery's final days. He died by suicide in jail shortly after the arrests. Some speculate he couldn't handle the guilt or the prospect of prison. His death removed a key witness who might have corroborated or contradicted his brothers. Community reaction and continuing debate. Reaction to these developments varies. Some Memphians believe Tony's execution will bring closure, others argue his mental illness should spare him. Some are shocked that James is free, others say he served his time. The case continues to spark debates about the death penalty, victims' rights, and criminal justice reform. It remains a reminder of the complexities of justice, how it can be both swift and slow, how it can satisfy some families and devastate others, and how it often leaves unanswered questions. As we close the book on this story, at least for now, what lingers are the lives lost, the lives forever altered, and the shadow of a grave that still haunts Memphis.